Okay, thank you, Dr. Campbell. Yeah, so it's a beautiful spring day here. Of course, as we refer to it in South Carolina, this time of year is Final Four or championship weekend, whichever you prefer. We're always in this position, so it's wonderful. But this award is very special. My dad retired September 9th, 14th, 2001. 3 days after 9/11, so it was a bittersweet situation, and for about a couple hours that evening we forgot about our nation's troubles and the world's troubles, and really reflected. He spent 40 years as a newspaperman and a journalism professor, a dean, and just a wonderful career. But part of that retirement ceremony was the establishment of this award, and it took a few years to get enough funding to go ahead and start presenting the award. And this was I've been to several of these symposia. I guess that's the correct word. I'm sure you love it in your profession when people ask you what the plural of media is. But anyway, it's an honor. I understand this is one of the biggest field, probably the biggest field of entrants we've had so far. And it's just a pleasure to be able to present this award. It's important. My dad grew up in Arkansas, and he was a reporter in Little Rock in the 1950s. And if you did one of these kind of jaywalking things where you asked the man on the street during that time, who were the Little Rock Nine? They might say, as an Arkansas baseball team. I don't know what that is, but the folks in this room know that 9 high school students trying to go to Central High School in Little Rock, and you have the National Guard called out by their own governor, preventing them from entering the school to learn. Today we'd have 9 students breaking out of school, and we'd have a truancy issue. They were trying to get in and learn. And so that was the climate that my dad grew up in. My mom grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. Actually went to high school across town from Elvis. There's some stories there. Anyway, she had always a lifelong interest in equality and fundamental fairness, and she really disliked anything having to do with bullying. So this award's appropriately named for both of them, and she was always a fan favorite of the students. So it's my pleasure to have this opportunity. I talked to Dr. Parrott at lunch a little bit, and I'm quite impressed and looking forward to great things from him in his career. But at this time, I'd like to congratulate Dr. R. Joseph Parrott for his having won in a very contested field the Ronald T. and Gayla D. Farrar Award in Media and Civil Rights History.
Now, I'd like to read a comment from one of the judges about the paper, and then we'll have a presentation. This judge says, and he hasn't heard this, this judge says, with a probing examination of activist filmmaking and transnational imperialism efforts, this insightful, imaginative, deeply researched, and richly engrossing article compels us to rethink the temporal and spatial boundaries of the Black freedom struggle. Mining a range of compelling archival sources, including oral interviews and FBI reports, Parrott is to be commended for drawing renewed critical attention to this film and its profound impact among African American activists, journalists, and intellectuals. Let's one more time congratulate him on his success.
All right, well, first off, I want to thank everyone for inviting me here. I want to thank Ken, Chris, and Rachel for arranging it, the Farrars for showing up and listening to my somewhat obscure project, the panel for selecting my paper, and all of you also for coming and listening. And I also owe some thanks to 2 organizations in particular that helped me research this project, the Black Metropolis Research Consortium at Chicago, which I think actually got left off on my bio, but was incredibly important for me when researching this. And also WGBH in Boston, which also supported this work. And finally, there's someone I'd like to thank who can't be with us, Dr. Barbara Harlow, who was a member of my dissertation committee and also a big fan of this article. She was actually the person who recommended that I publish it in Race and Class, and she passed away recently. And the world lost a wonderful scholar activist. So she is missed, and I kind of wanted to recognize her role in this article when I'm accepting this award. So, what I'm going to talk to you about today is this film, Luta Continua, and the importance it had for the African American community and for the larger anti-imperial struggle in the United States. And so, if I'm going to talk about the film, I think the best thing I can do is actually show you part of the film, right? And so, what I'd like to do as we start here is show you not just the film, but also the context that surrounded it. And the film that I actually had digitized and put online, any of you can go watch the full thing if you'd like, was part of this program that we have here. It was called Say Brother, and it was broadcast in Boston in the 1970s. And this film was shown as part of it. And so we're going to look a little bit at the beginning, but I wanted to show the host introducing this first because I think it captures some of the importance that this film had.
We're going to look at a film that was made by some brothers from this country about the liberation struggle in Africa. And then I think when we come back, it would be important to do a couple of things. One, to try to bring that issue home to people here in the Boston community so they can understand and appreciate and in fact identify with that struggle and understand that that struggle is in fact our struggle as well. And then talk about ways in which people might in fact really begin to support that struggle actively. And I'd also like to come back and talk to you about your own experiences, Karen, about the whole Polaroid thing.
Still supports the decision to quell the uprising in Africa prison, despite the revelation that 9 hostages were killed by British bullets.
The Daily Graphic has criticized the Mogadishu Declaration passed at a recent Senate meeting of East and Central African leaders. The Daily Graphic said that after the declaration, poor taxpayers in black Africa can expect to see more money being poured into the pockets of pleasure-loving terrorists living outside the borders of South Africa. These taxpayers will be asked to put the bill for further wild
Mozambican people, in September of 1962, the Congress of the Mozambique Liberation Front, FRELIMO, affirmed unanimously the will and determination of the Mozambican people to fight for national independence, for the wealth of our country and the work of the Mozambican people continue to be exploited by the Portuguese colonialists and their imperialist allies. Our people are murdered for participating in the struggle for the liberation of our country. The prisons are full of patriots, and those who are still free live in uncertainty of what the next day will bring.
And so as you can see as we're starting this film, this is how Robert Van Lierop introduces his audience to FRELIMO, the Frente de Libertação de Moçambique, or the Mozambique Liberation Front. But what you can see is this isn't just about Mozambique. From the very beginning, he's situating this discussion within this larger context of South African apartheid, within imperialism, and with the Attica Rebellion in the United States. Because the point of this film is not just to introduce African Americans or American audiences more generally to FRELIMO, but introduce them to this larger anti-imperial struggle that's going on. And so Luta Continua had this goal to forge a bond between peoples of African descent fighting a global struggle against racism. And so Luta Continua is one of the seminal films of the American anti-imperial movement in the 1970s. Filmed in the liberated territories of Mozambique with the active cooperation of FRELIMO, Luta Continua represented a transnational exercise in solidarity building by using the film experience to create a universal narrative of resistance and self-determination that could be applied equally in the United States as it was being applied in Mozambique. It provided an alternative to mainstream media that reported mostly on these military exercises, rather than the social revolutions that were going on within Mozambican society. And Luta Continua was the most prominent of a generation of activist media that forged bonds of racial and ideological brotherhood across geographic, linguistic, and cultural divides. Mozambique nationalists worked with foreign allies to depict the African Revolution in practical, universal terms. And today I'd like to talk about how this film specifically affected the African American community. Because Luta Continua was this vital cog in crafting what Kamosi Woodard has called a fictive kinship between African peoples on the continent and African Americans in this country. And disaffected by the limitations of the civil rights movement as it progressed in the 1960s, the continued inability to address these issues of economic inequality that were occurring in the United States in urban centers as well as in the South, African Americans increasingly looked abroad for new radical models of revolt, revolution, and reconstruction. And so leaders like Guinea-Bissau's Amilcar Cabral and parties such as Frelimo in Mozambique became heirs to this line of race heroes who merged radicalism with African identity. And films and interpersonal interaction were the key in development of these new icons. And so historians, I think, have been slow to examine these documents because activist films fit kind of awkwardly in these traditional areas of study of culture, politics, and also diplomacy. And when we talk about film, we have this tendency to talk about it as this kind of national lexicon, right? American film, South African film, radical American film. And so these moments of transnational collaboration really tend to get lost within the historiography. Yet the practice of Black filmmaking, and specifically Pan-African filmmaking, opened and disseminated new pathways for protest, new pathways for communal development and institution buildings in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so the reason why is because films were the most accessible form of mass communication. They allowed youths who had never been to Africa to kind of imagine themselves as part of a single anti-imperial struggle by putting them, as you saw in the beginning of that film clip, in the boats, in the marches with the soldiers of Frelimo. And so films like Luta Continua provided accessible primers, essentially, on African revolution for American youth. It inspired activists to reinvigorate their own communities by applying lessons of the cooperative anti-capitalist struggle that was going on in Mozambique to their own cities, to their own neighborhoods. And though Pan-African sentiment really helped legitimize Frelimo and its socialist reading of world history, this stress on ideological solidarity really undermined these strict racial identifications. And it therefore contributed to what Cynthia Young has called the growth of a U.S. third world left that was more inclusive, that went beyond the Black community alone, and formed bonds between radical American reformers and socialist nationalists in places like Mozambique, specifically to challenge this kind of dominant Cold War liberal paradigm that was operating in the United States. And so this merging of racial and ideological solidarity helped build transnational Black institutions and revive interest in African revolutions that would directly lead into the more familiar anti-apartheid organizing of the next decade. And so the success of Luta Continua evolved directly out of the popularity of these Lusophone socialist liberation fronts that were operating in the 1970s. In Mozambique, down here in the south, we have Frelimo, the MPLA in Angola, and Guinea-Bissau in the PIGC in this very small state of Guinea-Bissau, as well as the Cabo Verde Islands. And these three groups all had common socialist revolutionary characteristics, and they cooperated with each other on the the international stage. And outside of Vietnam, especially in the 1970s, these were essentially the most successful revolutions. The ANC was not exceptionally active. The liberation groups in Zimbabwe were just starting to get a foothold. And so these groups, especially parties like Frelimo, individuals like Amilcar Cabral, really became models for Americans who were looking abroad to try to articulate an active resistance against the American capitalist, racialist system. And so the Black community in the United States had been especially interested in Africa since about the 1950s. But continued economic discrimination in the United States led young activists in more radical directions as we entered in the era of Black Power in the late 60s and 1970s. And a core group of Black Power leaders, including Stokely Carmichael and Amiri Baraka, really started to become attracted to these specific movements in the early 1970s. You also had the Black Panther magazine devoting increasing space to these revolutions that were going on. And you had specifically Pan-African organizations, self-consciously Pan-African organizations, like the Students Organized for Black Unity, or SOBU, later known as YOBU for the Youth Organized for Black Unity, that established their own periodicals that really emphasized this idea of a Black transnational resistance. And so in collapsing the geographical, linguistic, and political differences between the United States and Africa, these radical activists really legitimized their own movements through the celebration of continental achievements undertaken by Frelimo and the PAIGC. And so these Portuguese African nationalists recognized that there was this community within the United States that was sympathetic to them, and they actively cultivated this international support. Leaders like Cabral and Eduardo Mondlane, who was the first president of Frelimo and whose voice you heard at the beginning of the film, believed that they could gain allies overseas and really put pressure on Portugal's war effort. Portugal was heavily funded, got most of its arms from Western countries like the United States, like France. And so what Frelimo said is the internationalization of colonial aggression, this idea that we're going to use NATO weapons to fight these wars, must be opposed with the internationalization of the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist action. And these socialist freedom fighters naturally looked first to radical African states and also Eastern Europe for arms and support, but they also looked to the United States as well. And initial appeals in the early 1960s to the government did not bear fruit. But instead of giving up on the country, what individuals like Eduardo Mondlane did is actually appeal over the heads of the government to the people and to these sympathetic audiences. And Mondlane had actually been educated in the United States. He was actually educated at Oberlin in Ohio and then Northwestern, where he got his PhD. And so he really took the lead of these socialist parties in appealing to the United States. And Frelimo became kind of the bridgehead between Africa and the US. And so Mondlane took the lead on this until 1969 when he was assassinated. And after that, Sharfuddin Khan, who was the permanent representative to the UN for Frelimo, really became this kind of point of contact for individuals in the United States who were interested in uniting these anti-imperial movements into a single global struggle. And yet, the commitment to the Lusophone cause in the African American community in the late 1960s and early 1970s was still relatively small. It was mainly a few kind of senior, more intellectual figures like Baraka, like Carmichael, like a number of folks who were operating in Harlem, but it wasn't exceptionally deep. And this was a problem because in order to change American policy, you really need to have a mass movement to convince politicians to act on this. And this is what Frelimo understood. And so the question Frelimo faces, how do we let people know about this revolution? How do we win them over to our side? And how do we make our texts about our revolution, about our ideology, appropriate, readable, approachable for the entire black population when sometimes this seems too remote, sometimes it's a little bit too theoretically complex for the average person to want to spend their Saturday afternoons reading about Marxist ideology, right? How do we figure out a way to appeal to the common person, to get them out in the streets? And the simple solution was to go to film. Film is one of those mediums that can access, that can interest a mass audience and introduce to them fairly complex ideas without completely losing their attention. And so radical filmmaking emerged in the 1960s as a way of critiquing Cold War America and documenting some of these leftist alternatives into which Frelimo kind of lumped itself. And so as a mass medium, films extended the popular challenge to this kind of liberal internationalist order beyond the rarefied air of universities, of intellectual salons where people read Cabral, or they read Marx, or they read Frantz Fanon, right? And so filmmakers were essentially creating scripts for analyzing, resisting, and organizing against this dominant capitalist internationalist system. And so given the limited space for resistance within the Cold War, these filmmakers, especially American filmmakers, were looking abroad for evidence of success against this fight, for the fight against racism, domestic poverty, economic exploitation, and police brutality. And such films, not just the ones that I have shown up here, which are almost all about Southern Africa, but a number of films that were made in the United States about the Attica prison rebellions, about a number of other things. Cynthia Young has talked about this extensively in her book, used essentially these foreign revolutions to illustrate this idea of resistance that's happening in the United States. But these transnational commonalities, especially in these American-made films, tended to be limited to cycles of exploitation and violence. What you didn't have is real guidelines for action. They tended to be stock footage that were just kind of rolled in and shown to be some kind of global oppressive system instead of a global proactive revolutionary system that's pushing back against this. And so, as most of these parties did, Frelimo, PAIGC, the MPLA to a certain extent, mixed this destructive aspect, this lashing back out against this violent system, with the constructive, replacing it with a new social society that actually served the people. This emphasis really on the creation of a unified nation that was happening at the same time they're eliminating the colonial structure. And so the party's goal, Moonlan's goal before he died, was to create a film that could capture the two sides to this coin and communicate this to people in the United States and Europe in a way that was understandable to foreign audiences, that made sense to foreign audiences. And so the Lusophone socialist parties looked to international allies to help them make these films. And there are two reasons for this. Number one, these allies could tailor the message of the Lusophone nationalist movements to the local context of these countries, right? These Portuguese Africans don't necessarily know what are the most pressing issues in Boston or Chicago or Atlanta, but these local people do. And so they're able to translate some of this Marxist ideology into a way that makes sense to people on the ground. And second, it's the matter of resources. Many of these liberation movements, they're fighting wars. They don't have a lot of extra time or funds to go dealing with this film. And so this is a way to bring other people in to participate and to finance this. And by the 1970s, there had been a number of films made through this kind of collaboration, mostly concentrating on the military exploits of these regimes. And this changed in 1971 when a woman named Margaret Dickinson, she was a British labor activist, a close Frelimo ally, produced the films Behind the Lines. And the film concentrated on Frelimo's campaigns to expand education, to build health centers, to create gender equality. And Behind the Lines played around the United States. It was relatively popular. But really what it was, because she was a British labor activist, it was speaking specifically to the European left. It had this different context. And so there needed to be a film that could speak to an American audience, and specifically an African-American audience, if you were going to have the Frelimo story mobilizing people in Chicago, in Boston, and Washington. And so Luta Continua emerged from this long collaboration between Frelimo and its local Harlem-based ally, Robert Van Lierop. And Kahn and Moonlan specifically tapped the young lawyer, despite the fact he had no training in cinema. No training in film, no training in image production in any way whatsoever. He's a lawyer, and they tend to have a kind of narrow skill set, right? So Van Lierop was active in the NAACP, was active in the American Committee on Africa, and he was knowledgeable of the Mozambican struggle, and he was a dedicated opponent of racism in its kind of global form, not just in the United States, but also internationally. And so Van Lierop became convinced that Frelimo's film would deepen the revolutionary consciousness of the American people, and that this was important to promote grassroots organizing. And so in late 1971, Van Lierop went to Mozambique with the goal of creating this film that could explain Frelimo and its struggle to the black community in the United States. And he tapped SNCC photographer Bob Fletcher, and the two of them accompanied Frelimo into the liberated territories of Mozambique. And they were joined for part of this journey by an individual named Owusu Saldaki, or Howard Fuller now, who'll come back into the story a little bit later. And the two Americans captured the heart of the Mozambican Revolution, the institutional changes that were seeking to change the nation from a oppressed peoples to a proactive nation, to a socialist nation. And they released the film in 1972 with Van Lierop narrating, and the title Luta Continua, The Struggle Continues, actually comes from the way that Eduardo Moonlan used to sign off many of his letters before he died. He would sign it Luta Continua, Eduardo Moonlan. And what a Luta Continua did is it in many ways reflected Frelimo's carefully constructed international image as this social-minded revolution. More importantly, the films reveal the practical implications of this ideology, depicting how Mozambicans lived under the new regime and the lessons that this reconstruction of the nation offered to American audiences. And brevity and Van Lierup's sympathetic gloss minimize foibles of the revolution, minimize some of the shortcomings of the revolution, but these weren't caricatures. In many ways, what they were was simplifications for the sake of communication of Frelimo's central ideology, and it very much reflected Frelimo's preferences. And it specifically narrated or presented three specific narratives that Frelimo often presented to the world stage. Those were the global nature of the anti-imperial struggle, the social character of the revolution, and the search for gender equality as part of this dual rejection of the existing system. And so at the core of this film is an attempt to explain Frelimo's scientific theory of anti-imperialism, or scientific as they thought of it at the time. And so, though somewhat simplistic, this Marxist reading of world events was vital in tying Mozambique to black living conditions in the United States. Because, as in the United States, essentially what you had was this kind of semi-imperial relationship. You have an impoverished, relatively poor Portugal. Its primary export during this period was cork, so that shows you just how rich it is. Depending on South Africa, depending on its Western allies, as depicted here in this Frelimo illustration, essentially to exploit and use the wealth of its possessions in Angola and Mozambique and elsewhere. And so because of this, you essentially had the United States acting as the semi-imperial oppressor of the Mozambican people, or at least this was the argument that Frelimo presented. And like in the United States, despite the fact that Portugal grew rich off the primary resources and the labor of Mozambique and Angola, they did not invest much back into the economy of its colonies, as African Americans believed the United States also did not. And so what Frelimo wants to do is replace this system of colonialism with a wholly egalitarian nation, removing distinctions of class, ethnicity, and gender by asserting the local control of politics and the economy. And so despite the necessary destruction of this old system, what the film was really trying to do was concentrate on these positive social aspects of the revolution. The true goal is the creation, and I'm quoting here, of a new and popular social order. It de-emphasizes the centrality of violence, presenting the work of revolution as this complex, multi-step process. The narration explains, and I quote again, "The people of Mozambique place their weapons in the proper perspective as tools. They are tools just as the pencil and the farm hoe are tools." These military maneuvers that account for barely 1/6 of the film don't take the attention the way that they did in former things. Rather, they are secondary to this social institution building, as evidenced by new schools, clinics, and cooperative farms. So we really have this emphasis on these social aspects, on these medical aspects, on these other areas that we don't usually see when we're talking about a revolution or a military struggle in Africa. And so the film says these destructive and these constructive elements are truly inseparable. And the film privileges such activities, and I'm not exaggerating this here, as farming, washing, nursing, and teaching. This is the majority of time that's spent during this film. Such images of bespectacled teachers and attentive children differed from these stock depictions of soldiers armed to the teeth and walking through the bush. So as we can see, those are here too. The explicit message then, the revolution occurs within these people, not necessarily on the battlefield. And as Van Lierup explains, one of the things that the revolution must do is to change the pattern of life for the people waging the struggle. That's the goal of the revolution, after all. Communities must organize to meet their own needs, since the government and capitalism have failed to do so. Removing violence from the equation was key for Van Lierup, because essentially armed revolt on the model of Frelimo, on the model of Vietnam, is not practical in the United States, and he understood this. And many in his generation understood this. So what does social revolution look like for African Americans based on these African models, if not the Black Panthers with their guns pointed in proper, safe directions, mind you? But what does the revolution look like if it's not this kind of armed revolt? And so, in line with Frelimo's scientific socialism, a Luta Continua defines real victory as the achievement of equality and social cohesion. This is what a successful revolution looks like. The discipline and organization of Frelimo party cadres are models for emulation. The narration explains that Frelimo members, and I quote again, have learned to submerge their own individual egos. And individuals do not assume positions of responsibility with the idea that he or she has inherited a position of prestige or power. And Van Lierup here is really targeting these middle-class civil rights leaders and the politicians who view the populist demands coming out of communities like Harlem, like certain areas of Boston, critically. And so what we need to do is we need to make this comparison a little bit more explicit, and we need to come up with ways that the community itself can take control, rather than depending on these major leaders. And so you guys don't have to listen to me blather on about this. I'd like to show you just a piece of what I'm talking about. This actually is the Open Vault, the WGVH website that I set up with them, where you can go and see the full version of the film. And I'd like to just kind of show you one of the major aspects that he talks about, and this is the issue of education. You can hear Van Lierup's gloss on this and the way that he's using this as a model for the way that African Americans can reorganize their local communities.
For the first time, students are being taught very basic skills: how to read and write, how to add and subtract, something about themselves and their country. They learn about Africa, its past, its present, and its future. Every day in their lives, the future of Mozambique and the rest of Africa is being shaped. In their lives, education is not a way for them to achieve upward mobility or isolate themselves as an intellectual elite, nor is it a meaningless abstraction which leads to dependence upon external economic conditions. Instead, they are learning these basic skills so that they can teach others of their people the same skills. Plus, in their daily lives, they know the importance of being able to count the number of soldiers, planes, and bombs that the enemy uses. Even though there are no expensive school buildings or other such facilities, the work of education goes forward, as the most important components of any school are students willing to learn, teachers willing to teach, and a common motivation to achieve a common goal or objective. The students and teachers work together in this respect. When school is out, the teachers do not go one way, into cars for a trip home to exclusive suburbs, while the students go another way, deeper into a ghetto. Instead, they are all part of the same mass movement, and the teachers live, work, and struggle in the bush with all of the people.
And so there you can see a little bit of this kind of gloss, a little bit of the preaching that Van Lierup can get into. Because what essentially he's saying is this: there's a solution here to the weakness of the Black American community. Committed activists had to sacrifice the trappings of this Cold War liberal order and emphasize, prioritize communal unity. Only with this would there be any hope of sustaining a meaningful revolution that could change living conditions in American society. There had to be a local self-determination of the way things were operating in the community. And this focus on equality also extended to the issue of gender. Gender equality was a central goal of Frelimo. There had been political and military training for women going all the way back to 1966. There were instances where women actually fought alongside men, and one of the key revolutionary heroes during this period was actually Josina Michel, the wife of Samora Michel, who would become the first president of Free Mozambique. And so women held vital leadership positions within Frelimo itself, especially in the spheres of mobilization and political education. And so Van Lierup highlighted this dual struggle for national and sexual equality as one reason for the party's success. And so images like this one that we have up here of women bearing arms became extremely popular and helped challenge traditional gender roles. And the film admits that, these traditional taboos, these traditional social roles they're not gone. They're still there. They still linger. But explains that revolution is an ongoing process. It's not an event. It's something that has to keep happening and keep being worked at. And so Luta Continua offered a first layer of interpretation for the creation of communal organizations to express solidarity and change for realities in the United States. Instead of using brief glimpses, instead of using stock footage of these revolutions, we're actually diving deep and looking at their ongoing struggles and asking, what does this mean for the United States? It explores Frelimo's new society and allowed viewers to relate their own experiences to what was going on the screen. And in essence, what Van Lierup's doing is distilling Frelimo's ideology to its most universal, with hopes that Americans would be able to follow its example. And so upon its release in 1972, the film became a key text in explaining Frelimo ideology to American audiences. And I think what's important here is that this wasn't shown in theaters. This wasn't shown, at the local Cineplex, but rather it was part of a kind of activist community that would accompany the film, that would interpret the film. And so Van Lierup would go out with the film and present it to audiences. Sharfuddin Khan would often accompany it. And so would local activists. Essentially, almost any group could reproduce the film. Van Lierop never actually copyrighted this, so he wasn't gaining from it. If you had the money to reproduce a copy of the film, then essentially it was yours. So the Tricontinental Film Center, Yobu, ACOA, and dozens of local organizations had their own film, and they would arrange showings of this. And this decentralized distribution system makes it difficult to gauge exactly how many times this film was shown, exactly what its impact was. But I found evidence, and let me look at this list specifically: New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Newark, Lansing, Jackson, Mississippi, the Bay Area, Washington, D.C., and Atlanta. Those are ones that I specifically have evidence that it was shown. I know that it was shown on television broadcasts in at least 3 major metropolitan areas, including New York, Boston, and Chicago. And in Chicago alone, there was a group, the Chicago Committee for the Liberation of Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea, that actually kept somewhat good records about this and said from the spring of 1973 to 1974, so the span of 1 year, they showed it over 100 times. So on average, that's a showing every 3 days in the city of Chicago alone. And the way anti-imperial groups use this film, and understanding that, is incredibly important to understanding the impact of the film. And Michael Shannon has written in The Cuban Image that radical filmmakers believe cinema remained incomplete without the actively responsive audience taking it up. And so the key here for all these individuals who are providing glosses, who are accompanying this film, is to convince African Americans, to convince other groups that are coming to see this, that when they leave, the film is not over, that they have to go and implement this in their societies. And so in addition to the document that we have here, this discussion guide for Luta Continua, you have these individuals going out and saying, on your way out of the theater, sign up to participate in our boycott of Portuguese or Gulf oil goods, which was operating in Angola. On your way out, sign up for the march that we're going to have next week, promoting our solidarity with Portuguese Africa. And so what the film is doing is it's offering this kind of visual centerpiece for this larger framework for Black transnational activism that could operate in these local communities. They could mobilize people in these local communities. And so I think it's valuable to look at the way the African Liberation Support Committee, or the ALSC, used this film in its preparations for African Liberation Day in 1972. And the ALD was actually primarily the product of Owusu Sodaki, the same person who had gone into Mozambique with Robert Van Lierop. And Sodaki had talked to Frelimo when he was there, and they had encouraged him to come back to the United States and set up some kind of mass movement to mobilize people to pursue this mass solidarity. And so he worked together with the Mary Baraka, with groups like Yobu, to organize this national demonstration in Washington, D.C. And the goal was to overcome what they called old thinking patterns of the Black community. They could only see the struggle as pieces of a whole. What they wanted African Americans to do was to understand that they were one piece of a global struggle against racism and inequality. And these organizers used a Luta Continua as their text, helping people to understand this fact. And so audiences received the message enthusiastically. There are a number of showings, and I have reports about what happened, but there's one individual who I think is extremely important for kind of opening our eyes to how impactful this film could be. And her name was Sylvia Hill. She was an ALSC member. She became an important anti-apartheid organizer in Washington, D.C. in the 1980s. And she left the screening and she remembered for the first time having this sense that you can have a science of change, because you have to think methodologically about what you're doing, right? This isn't just ad hoc, this isn't just showing up. You actually have to have a plan and a framework to make this work. And the film's message of unity through organization and self-sacrifice offered a positive message for achieving unity in the Black community, for achieving communal transformation in the Black community. And in 1972, there we go. In 1972, you could see the effects of this with the success of African Liberation Day. Tens of thousands of people gathered in Washington, D.C., Toronto, and San Francisco to pledge solidarity with Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Southern Africa in general, and also to commit themselves to undertaking work for the rest of the year to try to change these structures, to boycott Gulf not only for its practices in Angola, where it's cooperating with the Portuguese, but also because it had unequal hiring practices for African Americans in the United States. And again, Luta Continua became the centerpiece of some of these larger ideas. We can see it down here, right? Luta Continua, the struggle continues, with the Miri Baraka, with the Wusu Sardaki, who are helping to push this single organizing event into a movement. And in 1973, there's a second ALD celebrations, but this time at 30 cities throughout the United States. And you can see the way that some of the kind of attitudes towards this, the approach to Black Power, the approach to community are changing as we're getting things like Luta Continua helping to push this message through. And Frelimo really became a model for local institution building. I could talk a little bit specifically more about this during question and answer, but in places like Boston, they were setting up essentially co-ops modeled on the idea of this African unity. And women also gravitated toward this greater gender inclusiveness. They found in Luta Continua support for this idea that they were pushing within the Black activist community to challenge traditional gender roles. And Abla Thomas of Yobu summarized this primary lesson. She said, Frelimo's success, and I quote, demanded that the status of both Black men and women be flexible enough to complement one another. No longer should certain tasks be expected to be performed solely by the members of one sex. And clearly, we're not breaking apart these gendered stereotypes, but we're starting to have discussions of this. And men are starting to say, we need to be inspired by these revolutions to rethink the way that we incorporate women into these movements. And one of the kind of long-term impacts is actually this film here, Gorilla Grannies, that was produced by a woman named Ika Bertels. She had actually seen not Luta Continua, but Margaret Dickinson's movie Behind the Lines. And these three women were featured prominently in it. And she became so inspired that she went to Mozambique every 10 years to interview them and follow their lives, because this idea of them participating in the revolution was just so kind of inspiring to her. She could never quite shake it. And so this is essentially what we have, this impact of the film that's extremely important. And it's starting to create this new generation of activists who are going to then become important members of anti-apartheid organizing in later decades. And so finally, this popularization of Portuguese African scientific socialism had a major impact beyond the African American community. This wasn't just about African Americans during these multiracial organizations were distributing this film, looking at this film. And requests for screenings were coming from Black groups, school groups, community organizations, religious groups of both races. In fact, this organization in Chicago I mentioned earlier said that actually about half of their requests were not from African American organizations, but white organizations. And so as you get this common commitment to this socialist reordering of society, you're starting to kind of break down some of these racial barriers. You're starting to move beyond Pan-Africanism to a more kind of socialist U.S. third world idea of what organizing can become. So this is helping to facilitate discussion and cooperation across racial and ideological boundaries. And so Luta Continua would continue to be this kind of preeminent solidarity film even after the collapse of the Portuguese regime in 1975. There was an internal coup, and eventually independence was granted to the colonies. But instead of kind of abandoning the film, of forgetting the film, Robert Van Der actually redid the beginning and put in a new section where he talks about the revolution going on to create, quote, new men and women and new societies where there will be no more exploitation of any human being by one another. And so we continue to use the film now, not to support the Lusophone African liberation movements, but to support Zimbabwe and to support South Africa, where these similar struggles were still going on. And Luta Continua had become a symbol, essentially, of African independence and American solidarity. Showings now reinforce this idea, this activist belief, that triumph was possible, that victory was possible, because we have examples in free Mozambique, in free Angola. And Luta Continua actually entered the lexicon independently of these movements for radical activists. And if any of you guys have seen the movie Philadelphia with Denzel Washington, look at the very end and it says Luta Continua, because this has become independent of this. The struggle continues. We have to keep fighting. And so many people attach this to Cuba. But it's Portuguese. It's coming from Lusophone Africa, right? And so one of the things is people were already seeing this in 1976. And so I'm going to have an extended quote here from a Black newspaper that noted the film, quote, had become an important organizing tool for peace, solidarity, and anti-imperialist groups around the country. In that sense, Luta Continua has made a special contribution to the mobilizing of millions of United States citizens against U.S.-supported colonialism in Mozambique and South Africa, so much so that the title itself has become part of the movement's vernacular. And so Luta Continua represented in visual form all the positive aspects of the Southern African struggle. It distilled in 30 minutes Frelimo's ideology, moderated and narrated for an American audience. In its success, Luta Continua highlights a key moment during an era when radical filmmaking could really build a movement. It rejected mainstream media that was only interested in the kind of military aspects, the violent aspects of this global revolution, and it helped craft a counter-narrative that allowed African Americans to see themselves as part of a larger revolutionary movement seeking to upset the interlinked structures of empire and racial discrimination and really achieve self-determination at the local level. Luta Continua provided one of the first three-dimensional portraits of revolutionists with whom many Americans had begun to identify in the 1960s and 1970s. And this was not the voiceless stock footage we'd seen before that I've mentioned, but real transnational solidarity, real understanding at a deep level. It rejected the US-centric lens that prioritized subjugation and rebellion in favor of reconstruction. And there is little doubt the film had a lasting impact. During what people have called the ANC's difficult decade in the 1970s, Luta Continua helped overcome American ambivalence towards Southern Africa and refocus interest on this issue of justice in this region. It helped lay the institutional groundwork for activists to later adopt and challenge South African apartheid in later decades. And it helped reinvigorate broad public attention to these issues of injustice in Southern Africa. And so the revival of the anti-apartheid movement in the 1970s owed a debt to Luta Continua's popularization of revolutionary African ideology and the role it played in mobilizing communities, black, white, and in between. So with that, I'd like to thank you for sitting here with me for 30 minutes or so and take any questions you might have.
Thank you for a very, I think, fascinating presentation. And as he said, we're ready for questions and answers. And we always have a tradition here. We always give the first question to Dr. Farrar. So we're going to ask Brad if he would do that for us. But Brad, you know what? Dr. Farrar would not want us to continue without you introducing your family that you brought with you.
Oh, very sure. Yeah, thanks so much. I've got Dad in a year here, so we'll channel the question through. We have my wife Carol and my daughter Grace. Grace is a 10th grader at Herb Bluff High School over in Lexington, aspiring journalist. She does yearbook at her school and has a lot of talents that I think she's really got a lot out of this discussion here today. So thank you for having us.
Good. Thank you.
So a question I have is, the state of this filmmaking today. If you look at the human rights abuses going on in various parts of the world, in particular in Africa, and drought is something that you can't do a whole lot about. But famine a lot of times is a man-made condition. The distribution of food, that type of thing. What would somebody? Is this filmmaking being done? I know you can take a cell phone and that type of thing, but the research, narration, and the background that goes to this type of film. What examples do you see of that today?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, and you do see some things like this going on, maybe without the same level of access, but you certainly have. I mean, news programs like Vice are going in and doing these kind of things where they're going and experiencing life and sharing it, and then you also have things. I actually think this Girl at Granny's film is a good example, specifically speaking to what kind of these post-revolutionary states look like, because one of the things about studying the Lusophone world is there's a gap between the ambitions from the 70s and the realities of today and what these socialist revolutions were trying to claim in. And Angola, in many ways, has kind of gone off the rails under the leadership of the MPLA, which kind of threw it to the side a lot of its socialist revolutionary reconstructing priorities. But Mozambique is a little bit different. Frelimo has actually tried to stick with a lot of this plan, and one of the things that this film does is it goes through 3 decades of these women's lives, and she went back every decade and talked to them anew. beginning in the 1980s and going up until about 2003. And you actually get to see firsthand with some of these revolutionary characters what life has been like in this post-revolutionary world, and a lot of it has been good. I mean, there is a greater role for women. One of these women became a high-ranking Frelimo official. They do have access to housing, and their life has improved, but you can also see from it the kind of shortcomings of these post-colonial states. The fact that there's still a great deal of poverty, especially outside of the capital of Maputo. It's still very difficult for Limos to kind of mobilize the people in a united way, especially after Renamo was created and encouraged in the 1980s. And so, yeah, I mean, maybe don't see anything quite as, I don't want to say one-sided or propagandistic, but as associated specifically with the goals of the kind of what became the ruling party. But there are still people who are kind of looking into this and trying to get at the ground level and doing a better job of connecting Americans with this group. And as you can say, Guerrilla Granny's How to Live in This World, she's still taking lessons from these individuals about how to live life, especially in societies where we're not always getting what's necessarily promised to us. So that's how I'm going to go with that. Hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you. This was very fascinating and just illuminating research. The question that I had is beyond the formulation of co-ops, what were some of the other impacts that people experience locally in America as a result of your work?
Yeah, well, there's an interesting sort of that. So beyond co-ops, I mean, a lot of the political organizing, especially in places like Boston, came out of especially the ALSC and this idea that essentially what we're doing, and I've talked with one of the organizers of the ALSC, what essentially we're doing with this idea of, hey, let's get together for African solidarities, this is something everybody agrees on. And so there are a lot of divisions within the African American community, as there are within all communities, but everyone can kind of get on board with this. So let's use this as a springboard for kind of pushing through a real strong political platform. And so one of the things that you see, in addition to co-ops, which are especially popular in Boston and Chicago and Washington to a certain extent, you see things like community banks, where we're going to pool the resources of wealthier African Americans and we're going to invest them directly in our community. You get the independent Black education movement, and there's a wonderful book that just came out called We Are an African People, which I'm pretty sure is a Wusu Sadaki's quote. That's all about this, and it's headquartered kind of in Malcolm X University in Greensboro, North Carolina, again about taking control, self-determining our future in our education movement. And you also have some of the most influential Black political coalitions coming out in the 1970s around this idea, growing from this idea to some extent of cooperative organizing in regards to anti-apartheid. So Mel King, thank you, Mel King in Boston. Is very much using some of the anti-apartheid organizing that he's a part of to kind of rally people to this, and you get a rainbow coalition that's coming out of that. Chicago sees a somewhat similar movement. The person that I spoke with, who was a leader of the ALSC, actually ran for mayor of Houston a few years ago. And so there's a very important kind of political component here. And you get individuals like Amiri Baraka in particular, who's very much, I wouldn't say necessarily an African separatist, but he has this African nationalist component. And he's very critical of working with white organizations for much of the time. But after reading Cabral, after dealing with the Luta Continua, he starts seeing the value of kind of cross-racial cooperation. And so Black Newark starts to change quite a bit in the 1970s as he's self-consciously adopting the socialist African model that allows for, finding allies and using those allies to gain more political power. See it?
Robert Van Lierop.
Yes.
Don't know much about him. I'd like to know what else did he do? What other organizing did he do? Did he do other films?
Yes.
It really wasn't necessarily his area.
Yeah, he wanted to do a trilogy. And so he had a Luta Continua. After Mozambique gained independence, he did O Povo Organizado, which is the people organized, that didn't quite have the cachet, didn't quite have the political impact. It felt a little bit more propagandistic-y because it was longer, for instance, but about half the film was just Samora Machel at the independence ceremony, kind of beating Samora Machel and spouting things off. So he wanted to do a trilogy. He never was able to get the funds to do that. But when you're studying this kind of organizing, you tend to run into the same characters a lot, and they tend to kind of float around. So if anybody does anti-apartheid organizing, you'll know that oh gosh, why am I blanking on his name? Head of Trans-Africa.
What is Randall Robinson?
Randall Robinson thing. Randall Robinson pops up all the time. Prexy Nesbitt pops up all the time, if anyone knows Prexy Nesbitt. Most of these people, with the exception of Randall Robinson, who has this almost extra human leadership quality about him, tend to be kind of hidden in the weeds, and you only know them if you know them. And Robert Van Leeuwen is one of those people. He was involved in a lot of Pan-African and left causes. In addition to doing these two films, he actually became, I believe it was a producer, but he became very closely involved directly as an outgrowth of Luta Continua in one of the first black-run media programs in Harlem that ran for decades. And I can't quite remember what the name of it was. He became involved with Israel and the PLO struggle for a little while. He became involved with the environmental movement because he was an ambassador to the UN for Vanuatu, the small island nation that is essentially sinking. So he represented that a lot, and he was actually a lawyer. So I mean, he did a lot of these legal things, and you see his name popping up just very regularly. He was also involved to a certain extent in the anti-apartheid movement, but not as active as some others. And he continued to try to organize exchanges with Free Mozambique to try to bring expertise over there, to try to inform people about what was going on, to try to organize against the Renamo insurgency that South Africa and Zimbabwe set up. And so he's always kind of operating, especially in the New York area, in support of these various movements, and continues to do so. He's still alive, continues to do so to a certain extent. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, how old is he? When was he born?
I believe in the 30s, but don't quote me on that.
Okay.
But
in these cities, do you see any connections around remnants of the Panthers or groups that coming out of the 60s? Places like Chicago, especially, or
I mean, almost all of these individuals that are active in this Portuguese African Solidarity movement are coming out of the 60s, and the Panthers are important, but one of the things is you have a lot of professionals like Randall Robinson, like Robert Van Leeuwen, who aren't coming from, you know, the lowest classes, which is where the Panthers tend to try to attract from. And so they're not interested in this idea necessarily of, hey, let's go get guns and march through the street, because we know that's not going to work.
The guns sort of ended pretty early. You had community breakfast programs, and like someone like Fred Hampton.
Yeah, exactly. And that, I mean, that they do. They are very attracted to that. But they're, I mean, what essentially they are is the same generation, and they're just trying to figure out how we can do this in a different way. And so they're very interested in these local community groups. So Randall Robinson, who's kind of operating at the same time, doesn't take a high-powered corporate job. When he graduates from Harvard, he goes and he does pro bono work in Boston. Robert Van Leeuwen, again, actually turns down, he actually leaves his job with the NAACP, so he's working with them to go undertake this kind of independent activism that he does, and then eventually kind of comes back in the fold and works again with them later down the road. So, I mean, I think they're absolutely part, and they see themselves as part of the Black Power movement, but not necessarily that one iteration of the Black Power movement, much more aligned with community breakfast, community control, community self-determination, the Rainbow Coalition, and things like this, but they absolutely see themselves as part of the Black Power movement.
Yeah, and the flip side of that thing, and of course the Panthers, you know, and Waldo Martin and Josh Bloomsbury, what's interesting is the kind of, you know, national, sort of locally based groups that grow up and affiliate with the Panthers, and not necessarily run from Oakland or like that. But the other side of that then is, do you see any government reaction to these groups, or?
Yeah, not as much as the Panthers, but one of the ways that I know about what was going on with the ALSC is there was FBI coverage of them, and some fairly extensive FBI coverage of them. And they were accused, so one of the things they did with ALD is they raised something like $20,000, $25,000, and took it over to Mozambique, to Tanzania actually, to distribute among these liberation groups. And the FBI was like, well, they're supporting terrorism, so this is why, you know, this gives us a reason why we're following them. But so the ALC, absolutely. Robert Van Leeuwen, not so much, again, kind of flying below the radar, but there is a fantastic story, and I think this is true. I found it reported in one or two places. Never an official government source, but I did find it reported, that Luta Continua was actually screened by the military as a way of getting into the mindset of guerrilla fighters. And this was done for supposedly a couple years, in the same way that the military loves to watch Battle of Algiers. And so that's kind of what was going on here. So that's the extent of the government reaction to this. But yeah, I mean, the ALSC and some of these bigger groups are absolutely in the crosshairs with the government.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about the article itself, the
Yes.
creation. Did the article end up where you started from? Did it change along the way? What was your idea at the beginning, and what did you end up with?
The article was actually originally part of one of my dissertation chapters, and then when I actually put them all together and realized that I couldn't give my committee something that big, I cut it out. And I cut it out because I thought it was too cool not to. And it started off as just kind of this interesting study into this film. And one of the reasons I looked at this film as compared to there we go, to any of these others is I could find it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there are all these films, especially, where do we have it here? West Africa and Other Vietnam, that I know were screened extremely widely, but I can't find any copies. And as far as I know, nobody else can find any copies. And so I found a Luta Continua, and then I was thinking, well, this is a weird connection between this phrase that kind of picks up. And so I was originally researching what the heck is this phrase, and can I actually claim that this is my proof? Because I always have to convince people that people care about Lusophone Africa. Because literally everyone goes, I don't remember caring about that. I'm like, well, I know you did, because I have this document that you wrote, but you've forgotten. And I don't blame you, because anti-apartheid was 15 years, and this was like 6. And they bled together conceptually. But so I was originally looking at that, and then as I started getting into it, I realized that this film wasn't just an example of these. It was essentially the archetype of these. I mean, it had a real impact, and people were talking about it at the time, and I was very happy to find that. And the only reason I found this was buried in African-American periodicals is because I was searching for the phrase Luta Continua. And people would specifically be referencing it, especially around 75, 76, and I think one of the important things to realize about this is one of the reasons we always think of anti-apartheid as really kicking off after Soweto. You know, this is kind of the reboot, but one of the reasons why people cared so much about Soweto is because they were already looking there. You're already looking at Southern Africa. You already have this organizational, institutional structure that's ready to essentially hit the ground running and try to sell this as a new anti-apartheid movement. And one of the reasons is a Luta Continua, and perhaps one of the most important things that Luta Continua could have done. And this I don't say in the article because I've only heard it hearsay, is I've been told that a Luta Continua was actually shown in Soweto. It was smuggled into South Africa and shown in Soweto like the week before the massacre. And so this was one of the ways that people were essentially using the victory of Mozambique to convince themselves that yes, victory is possible, yes, we can win if only we organize, so let's kind of take this momentum and push a movement through. So it's not just happening in the United States. This film is also impacting Africa itself, and also Europe as well. Yes.
Time for one more question? Yes.
I have a question just about the phrase in general, because I see a lot of connections to Black Lives Matter as a statement that sort of is organizing Black folk globally.
Yeah.
And did this term, Luta Continua, show up in public demonstrations outside of the African Liberation Day? And also, what role did the media play in sort of helping to disseminate or distribute the term sort of nationally and build solidarity for Black folk?
Yeah, so it did show up in protests. I'm trying to remember if it specifically showed up during this period in protests beyond African Americans. It did show up in the LSC, it did show up at African Liberation Day. When there was organizing to object to Ford's intervention in Angola, a Luta Continua popped back up among both white and Black groups. And I think, and I don't quote me on this because this is actually after my time period, but I'm pretty sure one of the ways that it really got disseminated deeper into the culture was, pretty sure gay liberation groups kind of picked this up in the 1980s and started pushing it, and hence its inclusion at the end of Philadelphia. I think that's right. But yeah, and it didn't get picked up in the traditional media. It got picked up in this kind of, I don't want to say alt media, but it got picked up in the African American media, like Yobu's African World was very big about supporting this. There was also, during this period, and what my larger dissertation about is the creation of a real infrastructure of Southern African organizing, pro-Southern African, pro-liberation organizing. And these were kind of interpersonal connections. And that's also where this phrase got kind of passed around, and people would wear buttons with it, right? A Luta Continua, Victoria Sorta, all these kind of Portuguese phrases that would then kind of be circulated around this activist community and within this activist literature. But I mean, you didn't see this getting picked up in the New York Times, or for that matter, maybe it started getting picked up a little bit in the mainstream black press, especially the Chicago Defender might have been one of the big ones that actually came on board with this. There was actually a guy who was writing for the Pittsburgh Courier, right, who had a semi-regular column where he looked at Southern African liberation, and I'm pretty sure I remember him throwing it around, but that's about as mainstream as you got, were these kind of side articles in the mainstream black press, but usually it's operating in this activist press or in this, I don't want to say black nationalist, but black power press. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.